I'm Brian Scoonians, Pioneer Rep from Clinton, Wyoming, and this is the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast.
Thanks, Brian, and thank you for listening to the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast. As we round the corner out of spring and into summer, we've got an excellent set of guests lined up for an evolving question that I think is pretty timely for growers. What do we do about fungicides in corn and soybeans? Certainly, over the last few years, there's been more talk about the idea of them having a place in a spray program, but the big question I know I've heard a lot is, does it pay? And the answer today is maybe, sometimes, depending on a lot of factors, which is why for this episode, I think you'll get a lot out of the evolving research and what folks are seeing in real-world examples. And because we want to bring you the experts, I'm not sure we could find anyone better qualified in Eastern Canada to talk about this. After all, Albert Tenuta has been collecting and developing the answers around fungicide use for a lot of years now and isn't shy to talk about what he finds works and what doesn't work. Albert is the Extension Plant Pathologist with Ontario's Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs and is based in Ridgetown. Albert, thanks for taking a break from all the work in the research plots and joining us today. I want to start and get us all on the same page here, because I think a lot of growers, particularly in Eastern Canada and in Ontario, will be familiar with fungicides on wheat, but maybe less so on corn and soybean crops. When you are applying them to corn and soy, what is that fungicide doing, and what is it supposed to be protecting the crop from?
When we look at fungicides, or more importantly, it's their mode of actions of that fungicide. Some inhibit spores from germinating, which stops infection, while others act directly on the fungus by stopping or limiting its ability to produce energy. Basically, feed itself, energize itself, grow, and ultimately it wants to reproduce. So therefore, any method by which you can impact any of those metabolic processes, the greater potential you have in terms of reducing the overall impact of those diseases. We're also seeing more products such as those biologicals, which may not work directly on the fungus, but instead, are starting to enhance the plant's natural defenses.
Now, when you do talk about the potential for yield loss with these diseases, or talk about improving grain quality, how big of an impact are we talking about here, Albert?
Ultimately, we are, if you consider many of these diseases and pathogens, many cases they can cause very minor yield losses, or we can see when we have these epidemic issues, 2018 with Dawn, we've seen it with Fusarium head blight, we're seeing it with soybean cyst nematode, sudden death syndrome in soybeans. Diseases can cause minor or can cause substantial problems in the field. And that's where I think a misunderstanding goes, is that every field, you got to treat every field individually. Everyone is unique, and therefore they have their own unique characteristics and their own disease risks as well.
So when you do talk about those risks, what are some of the things that I'm going to be looking for if I'm treating, a handful of fields differently? What's going to make them different? What are the different risks?
Yeah, so if you think about that, think about it as if you take into consideration all those factors, like a rungs on a ladder, right? Which may increase your risk of disease for each of those fields. So basically, the taller or the more rungs the ladder may have, the greater the risks. And a lot of these risk factors that are there in terms of a management or how you can reduce that risk, a lot of that happens even pre-plant. When the crop's in the ground, much more limited post-planting rescue or management options we have. So some of those factors to consider are hybrids, variety, are they more susceptible, more tolerant? A lot of disease management, primary disease management, starts with hybrids, varieties, genetics. Then we build on that. We're seeing questions around residues, tillage, crop rotations, planting dates. Are you planting later, delayed planting, which results in those plant growth stages, say the flowering in soybeans or the silking in corn, correlating to more favorable weather environments. And of course, field history. Have you had a problem in the past? These are all disease factors or considerations that you need to take into account field by field. And then, of course, as we see, weather plays a critical, important factor here. So rainfall, humidity, all of those things play a key factor. And as well, we've got some new tools out there, such as forecasting models. So ultimately, all of these factors need to be considered into the economic question, and that's always the question we're going to get. Will it pay for itself?
Well, that's a lot to unpack here, Albert. So I want to take this piece by piece and start on maybe that forecasting side, because I think of what that dawn cast looks like, on the wheat side, that I think for Ontario growers at least, they're going to be more familiar with. When you say you've got that forecasting model, is it just logging in and now it's going to tell me, more about kind of the risk to that corn crop as well? Or what tools are there? How can you get a better sense as to the impact on specifically a corn crop in this case?
Dawncast is a wonderful example of how, if you bring in all the factors, both weather factors as well as cultural practices and factors, as well as the biology of the pathogen, and put it into a well thought out, well delivered, simple tool or model, can assist us in preventing disease losses and increasing quality. And that on the corn side, we and others are looking at, and I'm taking Dr. Dave Hooker and myself at Ridgetown, at the University of Guelph Ridgetown, we're looking at foliar leaf diseases in corn, a dawncast for corn. One thing that I have been working with and will be evaluating this year that's closest to a dawncast in corn that we do have available is tar spotter. It's for tar spot in corn. Everybody's heard about tar spot and its movement from the Midwest and into Ontario last year in 2020, where we've seen it in 5 counties in the Southwest. So there is that model available to us. Now, it's important, as I said, they include weather and pathogen biology into those. We're looking at, and everybody's looking at, ways to tie those models in with other information, whether it's precision, site-specific information, remote sensing information being collected by growers, or they're just their equipment in their fields to develop these disease prescriptions for your farm. But just remember, there's a lot of field validations that must go into this to make sure that these models are good and applicable and can work over time. And that's how one of the benefits of the dawncast, we've got over 20 years of that and been able to tweak the model to where we are today. So there are some limitations that need to be worked out in that. But remember, nothing still beats walking your fields and that. And we are getting better at being able to time and apply our fungicides.
So then let's talk about timing for just a second here, Albert. When you do talk about, soybeans and corn specifically, are you finding through your research that there is a better time to be applying these when it is more effective against some of these diseases?
Yeah, so again, it's crop specific, disease specific as well. So if we think of soybeans, we've got some foliar leaf diseases in soybeans like frog eye leaf spot and septoria and that. But overall, from an economic standpoint, minor, unless you have a very highly susceptible soybean variety growing. But white mold is our key one there, right? So there, again, the timing and the product selection is important. You want to get it when the plant is flowering, and it's those blossoms or petals that are key. So you've not only got to select the right product, you've got to be able to get it to where it needs to be, which is on those flowers and petals. So again, being able to be out in the field and knowing what's going on is key to getting that timing right. on corn, we're looking at two different timings primarily. The earlier application timings where it would say be a fungicide with a herbicide, that V6, 6 to 8 leaf stage, the economics, whether it's here or in the US or so, we just don't see the benefits there. Where we do see the benefits though is at that tassel application, particularly if you're looking at those foliar leaf diseases such as northern corn leaf blight and that. But again, if you're targeting, say, dawn or ear rots, your timing is going to be different. So you're going to be looking at full silk to 5 days after silking. So again, you got to know what you're trying to target, what you're trying to control, and selecting the right product and being able to get it where and when it's needed.
Sounds wonderful. Albert, I can't tell you how much I appreciate it today. Thanks very much.
Thanks for the opportunity and take care.
Next to visit with is Pioneer's agronomist for the area from London up along Lake Huron. Greg Stopps works with farmers in those areas to go over all kinds of issues that might come up over a growing season. And so, Greg, thanks for joining us to give us that perspective on what you're seeing.
Thanks so much for having me on, Andrew. It's an absolute pleasure to talk with you.
Well, I'm really excited to talk to you too, Greg, because I think after our conversation with Albert, we got this really good big picture view of, where fungicides, or at least how growers can start thinking about fungicide applications, on their corn and soybean crop. I think what's really going to help this conversation, bringing you into the fold, is having that conversation of what you're seeing as you're going about your day-to-day job as an agronomist with Pioneer. What you're seeing farmers are doing. So maybe we can start there. Is that, have you been seeing growers in Ontario adopting and using more fungicides on corn and soybeans?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have started to see more of that adoption, and it's been kind of a natural flow over from other crops like wheat, where fungicides have shown proven benefit, especially at that heading timing, and even before that as well. It's become very common in that crop, and that has started to spur that interest in other crops, and we've seen it spill over to how can fungicides help, especially in soybeans and some of the disease problems we have there, but for corn as well. And there's been a lot of renewed interest as well from southwestern Ontario growers and growers across eastern Canada, kind of watching what they've been doing through the Corn Belt with different fungicide applications for corn and soybeans, and seeing where it kind of pays, where it doesn't pay, and trying to figure out how it applies to our eastern Canadian environment more so than maybe some of the Corn Belt environment.
Then let's start specifically on the soybean side. What are you seeing that a fungicide might be protecting against?
So I think the main disease that we struggle with in soybeans, and there's a handful of leaf diseases, but when we talk about fungicides in soybeans, the big one for us in eastern Canada and in southwestern Ontario is white mold, right? And that's probably a bigger problem in Quebec and eastern Ontario than it is in southwestern Ontario, but there's certainly pockets throughout southwestern Ontario where we struggle with white mold year in, year out. Where fertility is high, there's a lot of manure in the rotation, where there's history of white mold that's built up in the soil, and it can put a lot of pressure on those beans. For white mold, fungicides have a huge effect and can significantly increase or protect our yield, I guess, in those scenarios, and prevent us from losing yield to the disease.
What about on the corn side, Greg? Is that quite as clear-cut for having an advantage?
So with fungicide applications on corn, there's a handful of key diseases that kind of stand out in my mind. But before I kind of go down that path, I really want to break corn up a little bit. Corn tends to be a bit of a catch-all, and in my mind, that can get quite complicated when we're talking about fungicides. So I like to think of silage corn and grain corn kind of separately in terms of how I approach them with fungicides. And I think the majority of fungicide use that we see, at least in the area I cover, tends to be on the silage side of things, okay? What we're targeting there is primarily leaf diseases. So things like northern corn leaf blight, There is some gray leaf spot starting to show up a little more heavily in the province. Some of those kinds of leaf diseases, as well as some of the stalk rots and things like that, like anthracnose that can come into the crop, right? And in silage, we're targeting keeping that plant as healthy as possible without some of those leaf diseases for as long as possible, with the end goal being the healthier that plant is, the better quality our feed is. And certainly the more time that crop has to pack as much possible starch into that year, which means energy for the feed, as much time as possible to pack that in there before silage timing, okay, or silage harvest timing. I think in our area has shown to be probably the most profitable and most reliable use of fungicides on corn in general. When we talk about grain corn, we're often targeting a lot of the same sort of things, right? We're targeting leaf diseases like northern and gray leaf spot, which can steal a lot of yield from you in the end. We're targeting some of those stalk rots like anthracnose that can keep or that can really decrease a plant's late season standability, right? Make those stalks weaker than they should be. Especially in years where we get early frosts and the plant is trying to finish off the year and it ends up having to cannibalize some of the reserves from its stalks, right? The healthier those plants are, the more likely they are to stay standing. And that's where a fungicide can really, really help. But things are a little bit different on the grain corn side of things too, because we start looking at other disease pressures like Gibberella ear mold, right? And its potential to produce DON and vomitoxins, right? When we start looking at that and going down that road, we start looking at a whole different kind of group of fungicides, not aimed so much at protecting the leaf and the overall plant, although most of them do provide some protection for plant health, but they're also aimed at potentially reducing DON if they're applied at the right timing, right? And reducing your overall risk there. And so where we've seen a lot of fungicide adoption in southwestern Ontario and across eastern Canada in grain corn or in high moisture corn, it's largely been from hog producers who are particularly sensitive to issues with DON and vomitoxins.
Let's think about a year like this then, Greg. Corn is in, and it was in very good time. It's up, looks pretty good in a lot of areas, at the same time that prices continue to look pretty incredible. I'm curious, is this the year we should be testing things to see if we can find a bit more profitability on an acre?
Well, I think you hit on the key word there for me, Andrew, is testing out. I think this is an ideal year with the way market prices are shaping up to start testing out some of these things, right? Obviously, the profitability potential from our crops, whether that's corn or soybeans, is there to really let us try some things and figure out what might be best for our crop in a year where we're not going to see the same sort of profitability or not the same sort of market prices. As I look at soybeans now, right, if you haven't tried a fungicide application before, or if you were really wanting to kind of try something different in an area of high white mold pressure where maybe you wanted to move to a 2-pass system, applying at R1 and R3, this would be an ideal year to do it, in that, you know, your chemical application cost and the cost of the actual chemical are covered by about 1.5 bushels to 2 bushels worth of soybeans, right? It's relative to the profitability of the crop, cost will be fairly low this year. So I think it is the right year to start trying and asking some of these questions. But when we're trying and asking some of these questions, it's really important for growers to apply, to leave some strips without application, so there is a fair comparison, right? And to set themselves up so that they're asking the right questions, and in the fall when they're harvesting it, they've got something for comparison so that they can actually look at it in more detail and learn something from it and come up with a honest conclusion about what worked, what was profitable, where did it work, where didn't it work, why it worked and why didn't it work, right? And then take that and run with it for future years.
That's a great spot to end this conversation, I think, Greg, and leave us thinking about how we might be able to do a better job of deciding when and how these fungicide applications can work for us. So thank you, Greg. Now, for the next guest, while we've talked a lot about how things have worked so far and what research has been done to improve application timing and more, Jamshid Ashigh is Corteva's Zonal Biology Leader for Canada and for fungicides. He's based in London. Jamshid, thanks for joining us today.
No problem.
Jamshid, maybe you can start off by giving us an idea of what your day looks like and what it means to be that zonal biology lead.
We work on the new fungicides that we have, at the same time developing concepts to help the growers' needs. We cannot operate if we do not know what the needs are in the market or what growers need from us. And so we pretty much gather those information, what are the needs, what are the gaps, and based on those needs, we develop our fungicides.
You know, I'm curious because in past episodes, we have talked about that process, in terms of what it takes to bring a hybrid to market, what it takes to bring a variety to market, and obviously the years of research and trialing and all that kind of stuff. Could you walk me through kind of quickly, what's that process like on the, fungicide side?
There are two different approaches to this. And that doesn't mean that if you take one, you have to leave the other one out. We always go with the two approaches at the same time. One of the approaches in developing fungicides is you take the molecule that comes out of the discovery and it's been approved for development, and you work with that active. Obviously, you test that active in the field, figure what is the spectrum of that active, and at the same time, you look at the mixtures or combinations with other actives. Based on the best knowledge you have, you don't go and pick something that, nobody knows what's going to happen. You basically go through the literature, see what are the actives that are promising, and there perhaps be a good combination or a big partner with your new active. The other approach is to look at the existing molecule and try to solve the problem with finding combinations that they would be effective against the new disease, better than the individual actives that you have. And again, that goes based on the information you have, and there is a lot of information out there. There is a lot of research going on, and these are the two approaches that we take.
It sounds like quite a job to both first identify and find that product, that can actually, have the result that you want, or even maybe it's just improving the result that you're already getting. But it also sounds like, as you said before, trying to ensure that we're not seeing resistance, that ball keeps moving on you, that target keeps moving on you.
That's exactly the fact. So, the reason we look at the combination, even when we have a new active, which is perhaps a new mode of action, even if you have an active that is very effective, there are two reasons that at the same time we are testing it against different diseases, we look at different combinations. The two reasons for it is, one is to broaden the spectrum of activity. The second is the stewardship. Now, we have plenty of research and evidence that if you just use a single active, resistance is going to rise. But if you have multiple mode of action, per fungicide, where you have multiple modes of action that all have activity on the disease, then you're reducing the chances of evolution of resistance.
So really, it's a thing for growers to keep in mind that this works the exact same way that herbicides have. That if we get too lax is maybe the wrong word, but if we get too comfortable using a single mode of action, we're going to develop resistance in weeds. The exact same thing you're telling me works with some of those fungal diseases as well.
That is correct, and that is dependent on the crop. When we talk about soybean and corn, where we often get one or maybe two applications in season, that is the idea. We need to have multiple mode of action.
Jamshid, I really appreciate the time today and you walking us through the research side of things and reminding us of things we need to keep in mind. That's it for today's episode and for our spring season of the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast. We appreciate you listening and sharing it with your friends and neighbors. We're already underway at pulling together our fall season, so make sure you stay subscribed to be able to get the latest episodes when we start back at harvest time. If you have any ideas or comments on this season or what to think about in the fall, you can always get in touch on Twitter at Pioneer Seeds CA or my personal handle at Fresh Air Farmer. From the entire Pioneer team, have a safe summer. Don't forget that if you ever do need more information or advice, just talk to your local Pioneer rep or visit pioneer.com.